All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last of our 2021 Summer Science Speaker Series talks. I'm Sam at the Mariah Mitchell Association, and I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening. I'd first like to start out tonight by thanking our sponsors, which include Bank of America, Cape Air, the White Elephant, and Cisco Brewers. As far as logistics for tonight's events, just like always, we have our Q&A open, and we encourage you to shoot your questions in through the Q&A all throughout the talk. We'll kind of be monitoring it throughout. We might take some questions throughout, but we will also have a dedicated Q&A portion at the end. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jon Hare. He is the Science and Research Director of the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center based in Woods Hole. He has a PhD in oceanography from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, and he has worked at NOAA for more than 20 years. Jon grew up in upstate New York, and he developed his passion for fishing and the ocean during summer vacations on Martha's Vineyard. Jon oversees science activities related to the NOAA Fisheries mission in the Northeast region, including fisheries, aquaculture, wildlife protection, habitat conservation, and ecosystem science. He also works to build regional science collaborations to address complex issues, including climate change, offshore wind development, and watershed science. Jon, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to pass it over to you. Very excited to hear you talk.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you for having me. Again, you said, I spent time in the vineyard, so I was just honored to be asked to speak to the Mariah Mitchell Association, given that you're on Nantucket. So I just thank you for the opportunity. So just Samantha introduced me a little bit, but just to run through it again. So I work in Woods Hole, Massachusetts at the National Marine Fisheries Service Lab. And I'm the director of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, which works from North Carolina to Maine. We have some work in watersheds, and we also do work out in the open ocean. So it's just a large area of real estate that we conduct science over. My training, scientific training, is as a fisheries oceanographer, which means looking at oceanography to help inform and understand fisheries. And that naturally leads to understanding climate and how it affects fisheries. So it's just a lot of interaction between the two disciplines. And I've worked, in many areas along the, in the Atlantic. I've worked in the Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, Southeast US, and Northeast US. So bring sort of an Atlantic perspective to the question. And as Samantha said, I gained my interest and passion for the ocean and for fisheries by spending summer vacations on the vineyard. I grew up in upstate New York, and every summer we'd pack up in the station wagon and go spend a week or two on the vineyard. And this is a sculpture in Menemsha, sort of recognizing the harpoon sword fishing fleet that used to fish out of Menemsha. And as a kid, we would go down to the dock in the evening and watch them offload swordfish that they had harpooned that day. And it was just to think about, working in an area where I could bring the sort of the love of science and interest in oceans and work in fisheries and helping fisheries be sustainable really drew me to where I am. And so just wanted to show this statue as a shout out to Menemsha and the vineyard. So what does the National Marine Fisheries Service do? We're part of the federal government. We work for the Department of Commerce and for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And our job really is to take care of the living marine resources for all of us. We serve the American public and work to have productive and sustainable fisheries, productive and sustainable aquaculture. We work to recover and conserve marine mammals and sea turtles and other protected species. And we work to promote healthy marine ecosystems and marine habitat. And we do this in the Northeast region, again, from North Carolina to Maine, from the top of the watersheds out into the open ocean, working fisheries, aquaculture, marine mammals, sea turtles, ecosystems, and habitat. Now we have this issue of climate change, which is, it's a global issue. And recently, the International Panel on Climate Change they're starting to release their 6th assessment of the state of climate change and the Earth as a system. And this year, 2021, they've released their physical science basis? What is the basis for the physical understanding of climate change? And then next year, they're expected to release, and what are the impacts of this to human communities and natural ecosystems. But this year, we have their assessment of climate change from a physical perspective. And what they've concluded is that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. So what they're saying here is that there's now no question that our activities are causing warming of the air, ocean, and land. Secondly, they concluded that the global surface temperature will continue to increase at least until mid-century under all scenarios, all emission scenarios considered. And so the way to think about this is, the climate change that is going to happen for the next 20 to 30 years is already built into the system. And the decisions and choices that we're making now will come into effect 20 to 30 years in the future. So we're looking to sort of we're looking to affect the future state of the Earth's climate. And then their last conclusion was, with further global warming, every region is projected to increasingly experience concurrent and multiple changes in climate impact drivers. So what they're saying is that as this warming continues, there's going to be multiple effects that we're going to see simultaneously. So the take-home message is that climate change is real, and it's going to keep happening, and we need to decide what we are going to do about it. And just to sort of bring that, closer to, you and I, and for those of you who are in Massachusetts, there's a very interesting study that was done that looked at flowering time. And so these researchers went back to Thoreau's notes on Walden Pond, and he was very meticulous in what he noted. And he noted the first flowering of a number of plants. And then that was repeated in the late 1800s by Hosmer, and he reported the first flowering of the same plants that Thoreau had done. And then it was repeated again recently by Primack and colleagues, and they reported the first flowering. And what we see here is that it's basically the year that these recordings were made. So 1850s for Thoreau, late 1800s for Hosmer, 2010, 2015 for Primack. And you see that the flowering times are getting earlier. So this is, service berry is flowering early, high bush blueberry is flowering earlier, dogwood is flowering earlier. And this earlier flowering is linked to the climate change, is linked to the warming that's caused by humans. So it's just a very tangible way for us to see the impacts of climate change in the natural world around us. Another local example is the sea level taken from a sea level recording in Nantucket. So there's an instrument in Nantucket that measures the height of the sea very accurately. And that instrument was deployed in the mid-1960s and has been recording since. So this shows sea level from 1965 to 2021. And what we see is that the sea level has been gradually increasing over that time. And if you look, convert it into inches, which is something that we are more familiar with than meters, it's increased about 8 inches since 1975. So, 8 inches is, it's about that much, which doesn't seem like a lot. But when you think about 8 inches spread all over the ocean in this area around Nantucket, that's a lot of water. And that is also a direct result of climate change. And then the third example that I'll give is air temperature in Massachusetts. And this is from a summary produced by a state summary. And it shows air temperature from 1900 to 2021. That's the orange line. And then it shows different projections of air temperature if we lower our emissions in green, and if we continue to increase our emissions, CO2 emissions, in red. And so we see that air temperature has increased from 1900 to 2020. It's increased about 3 degrees on average. And going forward, you can see the green and red projections overlap to about 2050, and that's the 20 or 30 years of, we can't really change what's going to happen for the next 20 to 30 years. And the actions that we take today will either have it be the green trajectory for air temperature or the red trajectory for air temperature. So in Massachusetts, Nantucket, it's flowering earlier in the spring, sea level is rising, and our air temperatures are rising, just as some tangible pieces of evidence that support that climate change is happening. And so this sort of leads to two separate questions. The one question, which is on the left, is how do we address the human influence on the Earth's climate? And then the other question on the right is how do we adapt to a changing climate? And just recognizing that the choices that we make today will be felt in 20 to 30 years. And so working for NOAA Fisheries, we are working hard on the how do we adapt to a changing climate. We're trying to understand how climate change is affecting fisheries, how climate change is affecting whales, how climate change is affecting deep sea corals, to help us make decisions about how to still have sustainable fisheries, how to still protect marine mammals, how to still conserve deep sea coral under a changing climate. And so I'm just going to walk through some examples from what we do at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in terms of the evidence that we're gathering as to how this ecosystem is responding to climate change. And I'll pull examples from fisheries, a little bit from aquaculture, and some from sea turtles. But really the examples are across everything that we do. And I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So climate change and fisheries, for me, black sea bass is a prime example. And in part because when I was on the vineyard as a kid, spent a lot of time fishing, we would catch a lot of scum. And I can count, 3 times when we caught a black sea bass. So maybe from the age of 10 to 18, I caught 3 black sea bass. And now, the way I talk about it is you can't help but not catch a black sea bass. So there's been just my own personal experience, there's a lot more sea bass in the areas around the vineyard in Nantucket than there used to be. And this graph shows, when you take my experience and then look at it in terms of a broader data set, this graph shows the estimated recreational catch for black sea bass in Massachusetts from 1981 to 2021. 81, I wasn't, 80, I was fishing a little bit earlier than 81, but I think basically the recreational catch of black sea bass in the late 70s when I was fishing as a kid was very low. And now it's about 10-fold increase. So, my experience is mapped onto this recreational fishing data that we have. There are a lot more black sea bass now than there used to be. And so what we can also do is we can go into even larger data sets and look at this situation in more detail. So the map on the left is the abundance of black sea bass from North Carolina to Maine in the fall, as determined by a survey that NOAA Fisheries conducts. And we've conducted that survey since 1968, every fall, using standardized methods. So that's the distribution of black sea bass from that survey. Red means there's a lot, yellow means there's some, and the blue is basically none. So if we compare the 1981 survey to the 2018 survey, we can see that there are a lot more black sea bass here south of Cape Cod than there were in 1981. So we see evidence that the sea bass distribution has extended northwards and the population has grown. And there's several studies which link this directly to climate change and the warming in the ocean in this region. Now, sort of going back to sort of personal experience, I don't know how many of you are recreational fishers, but there have also been a number of southern species which are now being caught recreationally in our waters. I spent a number of years working in North Carolina, and we used to catch cobia, which is the fish on the left, and we used to catch red drum, which is the fish on the right. And now, this cobia was caught in Buzzards Bay, and I don't remember the year, but 2012, I believe. And this red drum was caught off of Newton up on the South Shore in 2018. So we're seeing multiple examples of what we would typically have called southern fish now being caught here in Massachusetts. And that's, again, an example of what we expect from climate change. As the oceans warm, these southern fish can use our waters more frequently. Going to another fishing example, this is the same trawl survey that I talked about previously, but this shows the data for American lobster. So this is the lobster from that survey in 1981, and this is the lobster from that survey in 2018. And we can see, if we look around Massachusetts, we've got some high numbers of lobsters. And then if we look in 2018, it's diminished, not gone, but diminished. And we see this large abundance of lobsters up here in the Gulf of Maine and off of Nova Scotia. So we see a shift of lobsters from sort of the southern area, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Long Island, Rhode Island, up into sort of this Maine North Shore area where they're much more abundant. And so if we look at the lobster fishery, I don't know what the lobster fishery is like in Nantucket. I've only been in Nantucket twice, but I do know sort of on the Vineyard, Long Island, Connecticut, Rhode Island, lobster fishery has greatly diminished. And this graph shows the catch of lobsters. This is year from 1981 to 2015. And this is the catch of lobsters in pounds. Red is New York and blue is Connecticut. So it's catch of lobsters in this Long Island Sound area. They were quite abundant, particularly in the late 90s, and then that catch has dropped off dramatically. That decrease in catch has been directly linked to the increasing temperatures in Long Island Sound. So we have seen, again, evidence of this fishery declining greatly in the southern portion of the range, and that has been linked to climate change. But fisheries and fishers and humans are adaptable. We can change as situations change. And so what we have seen is that this is the lobster fishery here in this inset, which I showed you already. And then this is the Jonah crab fishery. So some lobster fishers, some new fishers use basically the lobster fishing method, but adapted it to catching Jonah crab. And the Jonah crab fishery has increased steadily over time. And one of the issues, they needed to develop a market for Jonah crab. So now you can buy Jonah crab. And now that you can buy Jonah crab, they can catch and sell Jonah crab. So it's an example of a fishery affected by climate change, and then a fishery adapting to a new species. And here's another sort of adaptation, as it were. And this is the channel whelk. Channel whelk is a relatively big fishery in Massachusetts. I did not know about it until I moved back to the Cape and found out a little bit more about it. But this red line is the lobster fishery in Massachusetts. And we see it decreasing, which we've talked about, that decrease being caused by climate change. And then we see this increase in the whelk fishery. So again, fishers and fishing markets have adapted to a new species which is available, shifting from a species which is no longer available. So we can adapt. And so the question is how do we help fisheries adapt? And here's a picture of a whelk. I'm sure many of you have seen the shell on the beach. but they are harvested. The trap here in the left, it looks similar to a lobster trap, but doesn't have a top. So the whelk just climb and fall in, and then the fisherman pulls the trap up and takes the whelks out. And so we did a study in 2016 that looked across 82 species in the Northeast region. And that study did a couple of different analyses, but one of the analyses was, do the experts involved in that study, using their expert knowledge, would they conclude that the species would be negatively affected by climate change in the Northeast region? Uncertain as to whether the species would be affected by climate change in the Northeast region, and positively affected by climate change in the Northeast region. And so the results of that study are shown here. Red are species that the experts thought would be negatively affected. This tan color are species which experts thought would be, would be sort of a neutral effect, neither positive nor negative. And green are species where they concluded that species would be positively affected. And so, two take homes from this is there's a lot of species in our fisheries in the Northeast that are likely to be negatively affected by climate change in our region. And there are some species which are likely to be positively affected. So working for NOAA Fisheries, one of the questions that we have, one of the challenges that we have is, how do we sort of mitigate these challenges of these species being negatively affected, and how do we help find opportunity for sustainable fisheries for these species that are likely to be positively affected. And this we can also map to fishing communities. And this is some work that is being done by social scientists who work for NOAA Fisheries. Dr. Lisa Colburn has been the lead. And what she can do is she can go and look at the fish landings in each community. And so this is New Bedford. So they land a lot of scallops in New Bedford, and they have some other species. And she can look at the vulnerability from the study that I showed you before. Scallops are anticipated to be highly vulnerable to climate change. And she can look at the elevation of the fishing infrastructure to see how susceptible it is to sea level rise. And she can look at the diversity of their landings. If you're only landing one particular species, similar to a portfolio, you've got a lot of risk. But if you can diversify your portfolio, you can diversify across risk. So sort of on that premise, she was able to look at these different fishing communities throughout Massachusetts and categorize them as either high vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, and low vulnerability. So Nantucket has a moderate vulnerability. The vineyard communities have a high vulnerability. And there are some communities, Chatham is one, which has a low vulnerability. So we can see that these effects, these large scale effects of climate change on fisheries, then are going to have differential effects on these fishing communities that depend on fisheries. And so we're helping to use this information to talk with different communities about their vulnerability and how they can respond to climate change. Another piece of climate change, we've talked about warming, and that certainly is a lot of what we all hear when we hear about climate change. Another piece is ocean acidification. So as we put CO2 into the atmosphere, some of that CO2 dissolves into the ocean and makes something called carbonic acid. So carbonic acid releases hydrogen ions, which makes the water more acidic, and the pH of the ocean decreases. And it also decreases carbonate, which then makes it harder for animals that make shells to make those shells. Because the mussel shell is calcium carbonate, a clam shell is calcium carbonate. So this ocean acidification is going to make it harder for those animals to make their shells to live the way that they live. And so this is another aspect of climate change that we are looking at from a fisheries perspective. And so this is some data. There's an observatory which was started in Hawaii, up on the top of one of the volcanoes, and the idea was it was very distant from any human sources of carbon dioxide, so you could get a very clean measure of how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. And this red line shows the measurements from that observatory. And you can see from 1955 to 2015, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing. That's the adding CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. This blue line, they then in the mid 1980s, when people started to really think about ocean acidification in the ocean, they added measurements of the carbon dioxide in the ocean, which is this blue line. And so the carbon dioxide in the ocean is increasing as the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing, because it's dissolving into the ocean. And then this light blue line is the pH of the ocean, or the acidity of the ocean. So the ocean is becoming more acidic as the carbon dioxide in the ocean increases. Again, going back to this slide, we're adding carbon dioxide to the ocean. It's being absorbed. We're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. It's being absorbed in the ocean. It's decreasing the pH, which means more acidic, and it's decreasing the carbonate, making it harder for organisms to form shells. And so we can think about that. Well, what does that mean for shellfish that we either harvest or are in aquaculture? And so there was a study done by scientists at State University of New York at Stony Brook, and they grew bay scallops and hard clams, quahogs, under different acidification conditions. So they've got a 250 part per million, they've got a 380, they've got a 780. So the 250 part per million was back here before we started adding carbon dioxide. The 350 is sort of about where we were in the the mid 1990s, and then these other two scenarios are where we are going in the future. And so these pictures are of young quahog, grown at different amounts of carbon dioxide in the water. And as you increase the carbon dioxide, they're getting smaller because it's harder for them to form their shell. And this is the same with bay scallops. As you're increasing the carbon dioxide, the bay scallops are getting smaller in the same amount of time because they're having difficulty forming their shell. And then this graph shows, if we look at days from 0 to 32, this is the percent survival of young quahogs and young bay scallops. And so a lot of them are dying. That's expected, but the survival rates are lower at higher amounts of CO2 in the water. So they're growing less and surviving less as we put more carbon dioxide into the water. And so that's going to create challenges for fisheries or aquaculture operations that are dependent on shellfish. And then similar to that other study where I talked about mapping this onto communities, researchers have taken this information, sort of looking across shellfish that are being harvested and looking at what communities are harvesting what shellfish, and looked at the sort of a social vulnerability. And so the Cape has a very high social vulnerability to the impacts of ocean acidification on shellfish. There are a number of wild capture shellfish fisheries, and there are a number of aquaculture shellfish fisheries. And so the impacts are likely to be large. And then out here, these purples show the ecosystem impacts. And so the Gulf of Maine is likely to be impacted more by ocean acidification than south of the Cape. And that's because of the water in the Gulf of Maine is different than the water south of the Cape. So we can take this information about the effects of ocean acidification on shellfish and then link the effects on shellfish to our communities to begin to understand what are the impacts of climate change going to be on our fisheries and our communities that depend on fisheries. But I want to shift gears here a little bit. And so we've talked a lot about fisheries, which is a big part of what we do at the National Marine Fisheries Service. But we also are responsible for the protection and recovery of whales and dolphins and sea turtles, Atlantic salmon, Atlantic sturgeon. So we do a lot of work with the Endangered Species Act. And sea turtles are protected under the Endangered Species Act. So we do a lot of research on sea turtles. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that research. So I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but Cape Cod is sort of a hot spot for sea turtle strandings. Sea turtles, they live in the ocean. They're meant to be in the ocean. But in the fall, a number sea turtles can get stranded, and Cape Cod is an area where there are a lot of stranding. And so if we look at sort of a time series of strandings on the Cape from 1979 to 2018, we can see this increase in strandings over time. And so we can ask ourselves a question about, why are we seeing this increase? This map here shows, again, Cape Cod, and many of the strandings are sort of on the upper Cape or the lower Cape, upper Cape. I don't remember which, but sort of Provincetown part of the Cape. And so what researchers have done is they've looked at the ocean temperature in this box, sort of the Western Gulf of Maine, and then looked at in years where the ocean temperature was warm, how many strandings were there? And in years where the ocean temperature was cold, how many strandings were there? So this is looking at the ocean temperature, sort of late October, early November. That's when most of the strandings occur. And you can see if the ocean is cold, there's relatively few strandings. And then when the ocean is warm, there are more strandings. So, again, we know the ocean's getting warmer, so we have more strandings through time. But this work also lets us understand is the ocean's warmer, so the turtles are staying in this area later into the season when that sort of the weather patterns change and we start to get northwest winds. And so you have turtles in this region, it starts to get cold, you get a northeast wind and they're getting caught by the hook of the Cape, and that's why they're stranding. So because waters are warming, they're moving up above Cape Cod, using the Gulf of Maine more. And then as the fall progresses, they're getting caught by the hook of the Cape because they're getting blown up against that southern shore. And so it's helping us understand why we're seeing this increase in strandings. And it's also helping us understand in a particular year and what type of weather conditions we need to be looking for those strandings. But it is linked to climate change and more strandings in years with warmer water. So we've talked a lot about fisheries, a little bit about shellfish and aquaculture, some about marine mammals and sea turtles. And I just want to sort of summarize a little bit here and just run through some of the larger issues that we're facing in NOAA fisheries. So I went through and talked about black sea bass, and we talked a little bit about red drum and a little bit about cobia and a little bit about lobster and Jonah crab and channel whelk, and we talked about sea turtles. Well, so that's maybe 10 species, less than 10 species. Well, in our region, we are responsible for 3 listed fish species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. There are 34 whales and dolphins. There are 4 seal species. We have 5 sea turtle species, 5 crustaceans, which are lobsters and crabs. We have 39 fish species that we are responsible for. We have 3 mollusks, those are clams and scallops. We have 9 elasmobranchs, which are the sharks, and we have 2 cephalopods, which are the squids. And I could have picked examples from any one of these groups and many of these species. We also talked a little bit about sort of the shellfish fisheries and how it could affect aquaculture. And then we have 177 fishing communities along the coast in the 12 states. And we talked a little bit about how climate change is going to make some of these communities very vulnerable, and climate change will make other communities less vulnerable. So we're trying to sort of look across all of these species for which we are responsible and trying to help fisheries throughout the region, protected species conservation throughout the region, adapt to the climate change which we know is coming and has been happening for a number of years. And so we come back to this question, how do we address the human influence on the Earth's climate? And that's a question which we haven't talked about, but we have talked about how do we adapt to changing climate, and that's where NOAA Fisheries has been working very hard, trying to develop the evidence and the science to support our decisions. And so if you look at sort of how we use science, science is evidence that it gives us ideas about problems and issues. And then the next level is sort of the policy level. And policy is formed by societal's goals, society's values, and some society's objectives. And so, we are working under a set of laws which are, intended to provide fishing opportunities. They're intended to maintain sustainable and healthy populations of fisheries and protected species. And they're also intended to provide for sustainable coastal communities. So our science is informing those policy decisions related to fisheries, protected species, habitats and ecosystems, and aquaculture. And then, then the next one is society. Then we need to take action, based on the evidence that we have and based on what our goals and objectives are. And this inset on the right, shows it's a summary, and it just emphasizes the point that, as Massachusetts warms, as the waters of Massachusetts warms, it's going to become more like current states in the South. And so if we go to follow a lower carbon dioxide emission scenario, Massachusetts will look like the yellow state. So by the middle of the century, we'll be kind of like central New Jersey, southern New Jersey. If we follow a higher emission scenario, by the middle of the century, 2050, will be like sort of the northern Virginia. So our climate is moving in that direction. Our fisheries are moving in that direction. What's happening with protected species is going to be influenced by that direction. And so we're working to understand it to then inform policy, which can then help us be successful with our goals, values, and objectives. Another one area, sort of the big picture that NOAA Fisheries is working on is in 2015, we put together a strategy to work across all of those species that I showed you before, all 80 so species, all 176 fishing communities. And we've been working on that strategy now since 2015. And a lot of the science, a lot of the evidence that we talked about here came out of that strategy. Moving forward, we're planning to develop what we're calling a climate and fisheries initiative, which will purposely link the climate information to our fisheries information to really provide us the climate-ready decision-making capabilities that we know we're going to need over the next 20 to 30 years. So again, science is just one piece of the puzzle. Science provides the evidence of what is happening and why it is happening. And then policy uses that science to inform actions that are taken by society. And so, all of these pieces need to work together to be able to successfully address either the adapting our fisheries to climate change or addressing humans' impacts on the climate. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions, and just really appreciate you taking your time to listen to me speak. So thank you, Samantha.
Thank you. That was really great. We already have a couple questions in the Q&A that I'll read, and I'll also use this time to encourage anybody else that has any questions to pop on that Q&A button. I know I see some people raising hands. We would ideally prefer if you click into Q&A and type in your question. So the first question from Val, what are some of the negative effects of climate change on the bay scallop fishing in the Northeast? Or, sorry, bay scallop fishery in the Northeast?
Yes, I mean, bay scallop fishery has declined in the Northeast. And again, the two impacts. One are increasing temperatures are sort of shifting the habitat for bay scallop northwards. And then, as we talked about, the acidifying of the ocean is making it harder for bay scallops to live. So those two factors are combining to make the bay scallop fishery less productive now than it was in the past, and likely less productive in the future than it is now. Now, I know, Nantucket has, one of the healthiest last remaining bay scallop fisheries on the East Coast. And so that, hopefully that fishery can be maintained into the future. But bay scallop fisheries further south have seen real reduction in their productivity. So I would say it's, primarily temperature and ocean acidification that are affecting bay scallop growth and survival.
Thank you for that. Our next question is from Jack. Is NOAA studying the viability of using kelp farming and/or eelgrass restoration as a local scale adaptation technique for protecting shellfish fisheries from the effects of ocean acidification?
So you have a couple points in that question. It's an excellent question. Thank you. So, it's using kelp farming and eelgrass restoration. Those are two, yes, NOAA is involved in both kelp farming and eelgrass restoration. And then as Jack sort of suggests in his question, plants take up CO2. So seagrass is a very effective, remove CO2 from the water. And then if you have a healthy seagrass bed, it then sort of, as the seagrass dies, it puts it into the sediment, similar with kelp. And so one of the ideas is that if we can have more seagrass, have more kelp, that can work to mitigate ocean acidification on sort of, a local or, wherever that restoration is occurring. So whether that's being used to protect shellfish from the effects of ocean acidification, I don't know the answer to that. I think there have been some areas where they have done sort of, they call it multi-trophic level aquaculture, where you're culturing kelp and then culturing shellfish with the kelp as a way to make the environment better for shellfish. But that is a to the last question about bay scallops, that would be an approach that one could look at for bay scallops. Have the healthy seagrass habitat, which is where bay scallops need to live, and then it's also reducing, pulling the CO2 out of the water, so making it a more favorable environment from the carbon dioxide level. So excellent question. I can get you some more information on that, Jack. My email is down here in the lower right corner, so I can get you more information if you send me an email.
All right, thank you for that. Our next question is from Melissa. Do you expect sea level and air temperature to accelerate in the next several years versus the 8 inches, 3 degrees since 1975?
So expect is kind of it's a loaded word, right? Because it's not what I expect. I think a lot of it depends on, where our CO2 emissions go in the future. And so there has been evidence that sea level rise in particular has been, accelerating or increasing faster in recent years than in previous years. It would be interesting to go look at the Nantucket data that I showed previously to see if we see evidence of that. But yes, there is evidence that sea level rise is accelerating. And where that will go, I think, is an important question for all of us, certainly. In terms of temperature, in this region, sort of the North Atlantic, I have another slide, I think. Can we close the question for a second? I think it's important to recognize that all of these factors, temperature, ocean temperature, carbon dioxide, there's a couple of different things going on. We know that there are differences between years. Some years you have a cold winter and some years you don't. And that's, if you look at this, this is the average temperature for the Northeast, the ocean waters off of the Northeast United States. And you can see, in some years you have a cold ocean and some years you have a warm ocean. And all of that is what we would call sort of year-to-year variability. And if you do some sort of just statistics on this, about 66 or some part of 66% of that variability is related to this year-to-year variability. The other piece that you see in this signal is you see this very long period, high temperatures and low temperatures. And that's a well documented 50 to 70 year cycle in water temperatures in the North Atlantic. It's called the Atlantic multi-decadal variability. And then just bear with me for a second and I'll get back to your question. And then this, if you look at this time series, this long general trend, this is the climate change signal. And this climate change signal accounts for about 33% of the variability in temperature. So we have both climate change and climate variability happening at the same time. So we could have a cold winter next winter, a very cold winter next winter. That doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening. That just means that that winter you had a cold winter because of the year-to-year variability. And to look at climate change, we need to look at the longer-term averages. So a big question for our region is what happens to this cycle? Are we going to sort of come down in the future like we have in the past? Or is the cycle going to stop and are we going to stay well above average? So your question, where'd the questions go? So to your question in terms of temperature, I think globally temperatures are going to increase, but regionally, I think we need to understand how this multi-decadal variability is going to interact with that long-term change.
All right, thank you for that. Our next question, it looks like they would like to see the graph again about the sea turtle strandings. The question was really a comment. They don't understand that graph. The dots look different.
I think is it this graph? We'll just walk through it again. So this is the number of strandings and on the Cape, and we see the number of strandings increasing over time. And this shows where the strandings have been occurring. And they've largely been occurring here on the outer Cape, but have also been occurring on the mid Cape. And the link to this paper is here in the bottom, but the strandings on the mid Cape are occurring with a more northerly wind, and these strandings on the outer Cape, which are on the backside of the outer Cape, are occurring primarily with a west-northwest wind. And the winds are generally out of the west-northwest for longer, and so that's why the scientists concluded that there's more strandings here in the outer Cape. And then now we're looking at temperature, and so we're looking at the average late October, early November temperature in this region. And when that temperature is warm, there are a lot more strandings and cold stunnings. And when the temperature is cold, there's a lot fewer strandings. So the hypothesis, the idea is when the temperature is warm, turtles are staying in this area longer. And then when those sort of the fall storms start, they're getting stranded here on the backside of the Cape. I hope I explained that better, but if I didn't, you can send me an email and these two papers are, they're publicly available. So there's a lot more information in those two papers as well.
I think he sent, or it's anonymous, I don't know who said it, but the same person said that wasn't the graph they were looking for. It is the
Okay.
one that shows 0. That's the one. That's all they wrote. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, how about follow up with me with an email and I'll try to answer your question.
That sounds great. And I'm also happy to be a go-between if anyone
Yeah,
needs that.
very good.
You can contact me and I'll put you in touch
Yeah.
with John. Okay, let's go back to the top here. Our next question. I read an article in the Atlantic about deep sea excavation. Now there is very little regulation for companies trying to drill for oil in the deep ocean. Little understanding of how the excavation will affect all species. Do you have anything to add to that? Any comments on that?
I don't have anything to add. Just a true, like a, the point of clarification. So there is, there's deep sea mining where companies are planning to take mine minerals from the deep sea. And then there is also, deep water oil exploration. I think that there has been some articles in the press recently about the deep sea mining. So I think that's what you're referring to. And again, those activities are outside. I believe that they would be outside of U.S. waters and in what we call high seas. So in the way, the ocean is split up just like our land is, and the United States has claim over the ocean about 200 miles offshore. And so if you imagine all the land with all the countries with 200 miles offshore, then there are areas of the ocean that are outside of outside of country jurisdictions, and those are called high seas. And there are a number of sort of international conventions that control what can be done and what can't be done in the high seas. But this idea of deep sea mining is starting to come up again as a way to basically mine minerals that we need. So I don't have anything specific to say about it, but just to provide a little more background for our other listeners. But again, I think I can see, I have seen some articles about the deep sea mining question recently.
Right, thank you. Our next question from Robert: what is the tipping point for marine ecosystems and pH drop? In other words, what is the historical normal pH of ocean seawater, and how low can it go before fisheries collapse?
So that's a good question. It's a specific question as well, and I don't have the specific answer. I know where I could go to look for the answer. So again, I would ask you to email me and I can follow up with you. But going back to this idea of tipping points is an excellent one. It's looking into the future. At some point, are we going to cross a line where it's not just temperature, increasing slowly, but where something happens and the system changes, and then something dramatic happens. And so the question is asking, at what point with ocean acidification does something dramatic happen? And there has been some work done on tipping points in ocean acidification, but I can't remember the specific points. I can say that for many of these changes that we are seeing for temperature and for ocean acidification, the rate at which these changes are happening is unprecedented in the geological history. So we are changing the Earth system very quickly. And we don't really have a full understanding, certainly don't have a full understanding of potential future tipping points.
All right, we have another question from Jack. Is climate change projected to have large impacts on phytoplankton primary productivity in Northwest Atlantic in the coming decades? Are you looking at changes in the length and magnitude of ocean stratification and nutrient mixing as a function of ocean temperature?
There's a lot in that question. So in the idea of climate change effects, so phytoplankton are the plants in the ocean which fuel all animal life. So on the land, we have grasses and we have trees, and our our terrestrial ecosystems are based on those plants. In the ocean, they're phytoplankton. They're little microscopic plants that are floating in the water. And there has been, there's a hypothesis which is gaining support, is as ocean temperatures warm, smaller sized phytoplankton are favored or do better than larger size phytoplankton. And so you might have the same amount of plant production, but that plant production might be in smaller sized cells, which has implications for how energy is transferred in these marine food webs. And there have been some review studies and a couple of other studies which indicate as temperatures warm, phytoplankton are getting smaller. So yes, there are potential impacts to primary productivity in the Northwest Atlantic. And then are you looking at changes in the length and magnitude of ocean stratification? Yes. One of the things that I will send to you, Samantha, is the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. We produce an ecosystem status report every year, and it looks at a number of indicators across this whole range of issues that we've been talking about. It looks at temperature, it looks at stratification. I'm not sure if there's nutrient data in there, but it also looks at fisheries. But the stratification is there, and we have seen stratification increasing. So stratification is, you have the ocean in the winter is well mixed. It's cold and there's a lot of wind. And then in the summer, as the sun starts heating, the upper layer sort of gets warmer and warmer. And as the upper layer gets warmer, it reduces mixing to the deeper layer. And you kind of get you get two different layers. You get a warm surface layer and a cooler bottom layer. And we have seen the difference between those two layers becoming greater as that top layer warms because of climate change. And what that does is it reduces mixing. So you have a lot of nutrients in that bottom layer. They're not getting mixed into that surface layer. So you're getting a decrease in productivity. So we are seeing those types of changes. Just there hasn't been as much work done to directly link them to climate change. And I will send you the ecosystem status report. It's a web document. I'll send that to you when we're done here this evening.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think if you don't mind, we'll just take one more question to round it out.
Okay.
Our next question, what is your thought on putting a wind farm south of Nantucket? And there's additional questions like, would it interfere with the right whale routes?
So, NOAA Fisheries perspective or point of view is that we're trying to have offshore wind energy development and sustainable fisheries and species conservation. And we think that there are ways to develop offshore wind that work for our fisheries and work for our protected species. The offshore wind, that is one approach which people are proposing to solve the human impacts on climate. It's renewable energy source. So the more energy we produce through renewable means, the less carbon dioxide we're emitting into the atmosphere. So it becomes one piece of a solution to the human-caused climate change issue. And then on the NOAA Fisheries perspective, we think that can be done, and we can work to maintain our sustainable fisheries, and we can work to keep our endangered species like the North Atlantic right whale protected. But it's going to take all of us working together to find those solutions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. To everyone out there, thank you for listening and thank you for joining us this evening. Another thank you to our sponsors, which are Bank of America, Cape Air, The White Elephant, and Cisco Brewers. John, thank you again for joining us this
No,
evening.
thank you for having me, Samantha, and thank you for all the questions. Excellent questions.
Yes, and as we mentioned before, I'm happy if you need links to anything or you need any information, I'm happy to touch base with John and get that information to you. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.